I've worked the late shift at the distribution office for a little over 3 years. Nothing about the job is unusual. That's part of why I stayed. The work is predictable. Shipment logs, delivery times, small discrepancies that need to be corrected before they turn into larger problems. Most nights follow the same structure. You show up, take over from the day staff, process what comes in, leave before sunrise. There aren't many surprises. At least, there weren't before I started paying attention. My shift begins at 8 p.m. By the time I arrive, the day team is already packing up. They pass along notes, delays, missing items, things that need to be reviewed again. It's routine. No one lingers. Everyone is used to the handoff. I take my usual station near the side windows, the ones facing the loading yard. From there, I can see a narrow stretch of sky above the surrounding buildings. Not enough to notice anything specific, just enough to register movement, light, weather. The office stays active through the night, but in a controlled way. Printers run in the background. Forklifts move in steady intervals. The ventilation system hums constantly, filling the quiet spaces between tasks. It's not silent, but it's consistent. Consistency matters here. Small errors can cause delays that carry into the next shift. So I've always been careful. I check everything twice. If something doesn't match, I trace it back until it does. It's not difficult work, just detailed. There are 5 of us on night rotation. We don't talk much unless we need to. Everyone sticks to their part, and that keeps things moving. Around 11:30, I take my first break. It's not officially scheduled, but I go at the same time every night. I step outside through the side exit, the one closest to my station. The change is immediate when the door closes behind me. The mechanical noise drops off, replaced by open air and distant traffic. There's a fenced area just outside, where people usually stand. I don't smoke, but I go there anyway. It's quiet. It gives me a few minutes away from the screens. From that spot, you can see more of the sky. Not clearly, not in detail, but enough that if something changed, you'd notice. I didn't think about that at the time. It was just part of the routine. Like everything else, step outside, stand near the fence, look up for a second without really focusing on anything, then go back in and continue the shift. That's how it had always been. Nothing out of place. Nothing worth remembering. It started the same way as every other night. By the time I stepped outside for my break, the rhythm of the shift had already settled in. A few minor discrepancies in shipment logs. Nothing unusual. I had cleared most of them before stepping away. The building behind me carried on as it always did. Low mechanical sounds filtering faintly through the closed door. The air felt cooler than it had earlier. Not cold, just steady. There was a light breeze moving across the lot, enough to shift loose debris along the pavement. Traffic on the main road was thinner than usual but still present. A car passed every few minutes, headlights cutting briefly across the fence before disappearing down the street. I walked to the same spot near the fence and stopped there, facing outward. It wasn't something I thought about, just part of the routine. Stand there for a few minutes, clear my head, then go back inside. At some point, I looked up. I don't remember deciding to do it. It was just a natural movement. The way your eyes drift when there's nothing specific to focus on. The sky was mostly clear, a few thin clouds, nothing dense enough to block anything out. The moon was visible, slightly off-center, not full, but bright enough to stand out against everything else. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was the second one. At first, I didn't register it as separate. My brain tried to interpret it as something else. A reflection, maybe, or a visual overlap caused by light passing through the thin cloud layer. It was dimmer, positioned a short distance away from the real moon, not directly aligned, but close enough that it felt connected. I narrowed my focus, adjusting my position slightly to see if the angle changed anything. It didn't. Both shapes remained exactly where they were. The second one wasn't as bright. It had a softer edge, less defined, but still distinct enough that it couldn't be mistaken for a cloud or distortion. It held its shape in a way that didn't match anything else in the sky. I blinked a few times, expecting it to shift or disappear. It didn't. For a few seconds, I just stood there, trying to make sense of it without overthinking. There are explanations for things like that. Light reflecting off glass, even at odd angles. Atmospheric conditions that distort perception. I've seen stranger things explained in simple ways before, so I tested it the way I normally would. I moved a few steps to the left, then back to where I started, changed the angle again, looked away for a moment, then back up. It stayed consistent. The distance between the two didn't change. The brightness difference remained the same. If it was a reflection, it should have shifted with me, but it didn't. A car passed behind me, tires rolling over uneven pavement. The sound pulled my attention away for a moment. When I looked back up, both were still there. Nothing else in the environment reacted. No one stopped to look. No change in traffic. No indication that anything unusual was happening beyond what I was seeing. That was the part that made it easier to dismiss. If it had been something obvious, something bright enough or large enough to draw attention, someone else would have noticed. There would have been some reaction, even a small one. But everything continued exactly as it should have. So I stood there for another minute, watching it without really thinking about it. Then I checked the time on my phone, turned back toward the building, and went inside. By the time I sat back down at my station, I had already decided it wasn't worth focusing on. There were simpler explanations. There usually are. I didn't think about it much for the first hour after I went back inside. Work picked up slightly around midnight. A delayed truck finally checked in, and its records didn't match what had been logged earlier. That took most of my attention. Cross-checking timestamps, verifying pallet counts, sending a quick note to the supervisor on duty. It was routine, the kind of small inconsistency that shows up every night in some form. Still, the image stayed in the back of my mind. Not clearly, not in a way that interrupted anything, but present enough that I found myself glancing toward the window without realizing I was doing it. The angle from my station didn't give a full view of the sky, just a narrow strip above the loading area. Nothing unusual showed from that position. At around 1:10, I took another break. This time, I didn't hesitate when I stepped outside. I walked directly to the fence and looked up immediately before doing anything else. Both were there, same positioning as before. The brighter one, unchanged. The dimmer one, still slightly offset. If anything, the separation between them felt more defined now, like my eyes had adjusted enough to distinguish them more clearly. I took my phone out without really thinking about it. The camera opened to its default setting. I pointed it upward, framing both shapes as best as I could. The screen showed a clear sky, the main moon visible near the center. Just one. I adjusted the angle, zoomed in slightly, then out again. Checked the exposure settings, tapped the screen to refocus. The image remained consistent. One moon. Nothing else. I lowered the phone and looked up again. 2. I repeated it a few times, slower this time. Up at the sky, down at the screen, back up again. The difference didn't change. It wasn't delayed or intermittent. The second one simply didn't exist through the camera. That made less sense than the original observation. If it had been something external, light distortion, reflection, anything physical, it should have shown up in some form, even imperfectly. But there was nothing. I stepped a few feet to the right, closer to the edge of the lot, and tried again. Same result. At that point, I considered asking someone else. Not seriously, just enough to test it. There was another guy on break near the side entrance, leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone. I didn't know him well, but we'd worked overlapping shifts long enough to recognize each other. I walked over and kept it casual. "Hey, can you see the moon from there?" He looked up briefly, more out of habit than interest, then nodded. "Yeah. You see anything next to it?" He paused for a second, squinting slightly, then shook his head. "No, just the one." There was no hesitation in his response. No confusion. No second guessing. Just a straightforward answer before he went back to his phone. I stayed there for a moment longer, then walked back to the fence. I didn't check again right away. I already knew what I would see. When I finally looked up, both were still there. That was when I stopped trying to explain it immediately. Not because I thought it was something serious, but because none of the usual explanations were fitting cleanly anymore. I put my phone back in my pocket and stood there until my break was over, watching without really analyzing. When I went back inside, I didn't mention it again, but I didn't dismiss it either. I didn't go looking for it the next night. That was intentional. I kept my routine exactly the same, moving through the first few hours of the shift without stepping outside early or checking the windows more than usual. If what I'd seen was something temporary, light distortion, a reflection from a passing source, it wouldn't be there again. That was the assumption I stuck to. By the time my first break came around, I hadn't thought about it for at least an hour. I stepped outside at the usual time and walked to the same spot near the fence. I didn't look up right away. I checked my phone first, scrolled through a few notifications, waited a few seconds longer than necessary. Then I looked. Both were there. Same general appearance, same difference in brightness, but the position had shifted. The second one wasn't as close to the first as it had been the night before. The separation was wider now, angled slightly higher relative to the real moon. Not dramatically different, but enough that I noticed it immediately. I stayed where I was and tried to orient it against the buildings across the road. The main moon lined up roughly where I expected it to be at that time of night. The second one didn't follow the same placement. It wasn't just offset. It felt independent. I didn't take my phone out this time. I already knew what that would show. Instead, I focused on the surroundings. A truck passed by, slower than the usual traffic. Its headlights swept across the pavement, briefly illuminating the lower part of the fence. Nothing changed. No reflection. No distortion. The sky remained clear, both shapes steady and unaffected. I went back inside after a few minutes and didn't bring it up. That became the pattern. Over the next several nights, the second moon appeared every time I stepped outside during my break. Not once did it fail to show, but it never appeared exactly the same way twice. Some nights, it was closer to the real moon, almost aligned. Other nights, it sat farther away, positioned at an angle that didn't match any natural movement I could track. The brightness stayed consistent, always dimmer, but still clearly defined. I started noticing smaller details. The edges didn't blur the way you'd expect from something atmospheric. It held a stable outline, even when thin clouds passed nearby. Its position didn't shift gradually over time, like the real moon. Instead, it seemed fixed for the duration of my break. Then different the next time I checked. I tested that once. I stayed outside longer than usual. Nearly 10 minutes passed when I should have gone back in. I kept my focus on both, checking periodically to see if either one moved relative to the other. The real moon drifted slightly, slow enough that you wouldn't notice without watching closely. The second one didn't. Not even a small adjustment. That was the first time I considered that it wasn't following the same movement at all. After that, I started stepping outside more often. Not enough to disrupt my work, but enough that I was checking between tasks when there was time. Quick breaks, just long enough to look up and confirm. It was always there. The consistency made it harder to ignore, but the lack of any external change made it equally difficult to treat as urgent. Nothing else was affected. The office functioned normally. Traffic continued. People moved through their routines without interruption. There was no immediate consequence tied to it. That might have been the reason I didn't push it further at the time. It wasn't interfering with anything directly. It didn't change how the night operated. It just existed, separate from everything else, only visible when I chose to look. By the end of that week, I had stopped expecting it to disappear. Instead, I started expecting it to be there. And that shift, subtle as it was, felt more significant than the observation itself. I didn't plan to bring it up again, but it came out anyway. It wasn't a deliberate conversation, just a gap in routine, the kind that happens when work slows down and people start filling the silence with small observations. We were near the end of a shift, around 3:30, when most of the incoming work had already been processed. A few of us were still at our stations, but no one was particularly busy. Someone mentioned the weather, something about the sky being clearer than usual. It wasn't important, just a passing comment. I responded without thinking. Yeah, you can see it pretty clearly tonight, both of them. It took a second before I realized what I'd said. There was a pause. Not long, but noticeable enough that it broke the rhythm of the conversation. I didn't look up right away. I kept my eyes on the screen in front of me, waiting for someone to correct me, or ask what I meant in a casual way. Instead, one of them spoke. Both of what? The tone wasn't confrontational, just uncertain. I glanced over, keeping my expression neutral. The moon, I said. There's been 2 of them the past few nights. One's dimmer. I expected a quick reaction. Maybe confusion. Maybe a joke. What I got was a different kind of silence. Not complete. Just enough that no one responded immediately. The kind where people process what was said before deciding how to react. One of them gave a short, uncertain laugh, like they weren't sure if I was joking. "There's only one," someone else said after a moment. The response was calm, not dismissive, matter of fact. I nodded slightly, like I was reconsidering it. "Yeah, probably just something with the light," I said. I checked it a few times. That seemed to settle it on the surface. The conversation shifted back to something else. Shift schedules. A delivery delay from earlier. But it didn't return to the same rhythm. There was a slight hesitation in how people spoke, like they were choosing their words more carefully. No one brought it up again. For the rest of the shift, I noticed small changes. Nothing direct. Nothing anyone could point to. But enough to register. When I spoke, responses came a second slower than usual. When I didn't speak, no one tried to include me in whatever they were discussing. It wasn't exclusion, just adjustment. Later that night, during my break, I stepped outside again. The second moon was there. Same as before. Same quiet presence, unchanged by anything that had happened inside. I didn't stay long. When I came back in, I focused on my work more deliberately than usual, double-checking entries, reviewing logs I had already cleared. I didn't want to give anyone a reason to connect what I'd said earlier with anything else. Over the next few nights, I avoided mentioning it, but the shift in the environment stayed. Coworkers still spoke to me, still asked about work-related things, but the tone had changed slightly. More measured, less casual, like there was an unspoken awareness of something that didn't fit, even if no one addressed it directly. A few days later, one of them asked if I'd been getting enough sleep. The question came in the middle of a normal conversation, without much emphasis. "Yeah," I said. "Same as usual." They nodded, but didn't add anything. That was the first time it was framed that way. Not as a strange observation, but as something that might have an explanation tied to me, instead of what I was seeing. After that, I kept everything to myself. I still went outside during my breaks. I still looked up, but I stopped expecting anyone else to confirm it, and I stopped assuming they ever would. I didn't notice the change all at once. At first, it felt like a timing issue. One night, I stepped outside earlier than usual, closer to 10:45 instead of my normal break, and it was already there. Both of them. That hadn't happened before. Up until then, it had only appeared when I expected it to, late enough that I never questioned the timing. Now it was earlier, and more immediate, like I had arrived late to something that had already been in place. I stayed near the door for a few seconds before stepping fully outside, watching through the glass. The reflection should have interfered with the view. It didn't. Even through the layered glare of interior light and exterior darkness, both shapes were clearly visible. The real moon held its brightness. The second one remained dimmer, but just as stable. When I stepped outside, nothing changed. Over the next few nights, the pattern continued. Earlier appearances. Longer duration. It stopped feeling like something tied to a specific moment and started feeling continuous. Even when I wasn't actively looking, that was when I began noticing it in places it shouldn't have been visible. One night, I was walking between stations, passing through the interior corridor that runs along the center of the building. There are no windows there, no direct lines of sight to the outside, just walls, overhead lights, the sound of equipment running somewhere beyond the partitions. I glanced up without thinking. For a second, I saw it. Not clearly, not fully defined, but enough of its shape to recognize it immediately. Faint, positioned above the ceiling line where there shouldn't have been any visible sky at all. I stopped, looked again. Nothing. Just the flat, uniform surface of the ceiling, uninterrupted. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to reconstruct the angle that had allowed it. There wasn't one. No reflective surface nearby. No glass. Nothing that could have carried an image from outside into that space. I didn't write that one down. It didn't fit the pattern I had been tracking. But after that, I started noticing smaller inconsistencies. Reflections that held too clearly at the wrong angle. Glimpses that appeared before I reached a position where I should have been able to see them. Moments where the second moon felt present, even when it wasn't visible at all. It wasn't just appearing earlier. It was appearing where it shouldn't. And the more that happened, the harder it became to treat it as something separate from the environment. It wasn't interrupting anything. It was extending into it. Once it stopped feeling temporary, I needed a way to keep track of it that didn't rely on memory. I didn't tell anyone. There wasn't a reason to. The few times I had mentioned it before hadn't led anywhere useful. If anything, they made things slightly more complicated. So I kept it contained and approached it the same way I handled inconsistencies at work. I started with a notebook. Nothing formal, just a small, plain one I picked up from a store on the way home. I kept it in my bag and only took it out during breaks, or when I had a few minutes alone at my station. The first entries were simple: date, time, approximate position relative to the real moon, how long it remained visible. At first, I expected the notes to confirm randomness. They didn't. The appearances followed a pattern, but not one that matched anything natural. The timing shifted, but not unpredictably. Each night, it showed up earlier than the last, not by a fixed interval, but enough that the progression was clear when I compared entries side by side. The position was harder to define. I tried using nearby buildings as reference points, sketching rough outlines of the skyline and marking where each moon sat relative to them. The real moon behaved as expected, moving gradually across the sky. The second one didn't follow that path. It held its position for as long as I observed it, then appeared somewhere else the next time I checked. That wasn't movement. It was placement. I tested it multiple times to be sure. One night, I stayed outside for nearly 15 minutes, watching both without interruption. The real moon shifted slightly, just enough to confirm normal motion. The second one remained fixed in the same spot the entire time. No drift, no adjustment. I wrote that down in detail. After that, I added more structure to the notes. I recorded weather conditions, cloud cover, visibility, even ambient light from nearby street lamps. None of it affected the second moon. It remained equally visible regardless of conditions. As long as the sky itself wasn't completely obstructed, the camera still didn't pick it up. I tried again anyway, more out of habit than expectation. Same result every time. The real moon appeared clearly. The second one didn't exist through the lens. I noted that too, marking each attempt with the same outcome. After a few days, I started sketching. Not detailed drawings, just outlines, circles placed in relation to each other and the surrounding environment. Over time, those sketches began to form a sequence, not a continuous path, but a series of positions that didn't overlap in any predictable way. When I laid them out side by side, the pattern became harder to ignore. It wasn't random, but it also wasn't following any system I recognized. There were gaps, positions that didn't connect logically, shifts that skipped over expected points. It was consistent in its inconsistency, if that made any sense. Reviewing the notes created a different kind of discomfort than seeing it directly. Looking at the entries all at once made it feel more structured than it appeared in the moment, like it had rules, even if I couldn't define them clearly. That was the part I couldn't explain away as easily. I kept the notebook with me during every shift after that, not because I thought it would lead to an answer, but because it gave me something concrete to rely on, something that didn't change depending on how I felt or what I thought I saw. By the end of the week, I had several pages filled. Dates, times, position, repeated confirmations that no one else could see it, and one consistent detail that stood out more than anything else. Every time I looked for it, it was already there. The first time it didn't correct itself, I noticed. It was late afternoon, just before I left for work. The light coming through the window was even. Nothing unusual about it. I moved through my routine the same way I always did. Getting ready, checking the time, making sure I wasn't running late. On the way out, I passed the mirror near the door. I didn't stop, but something in the reflection caught my attention. I stepped back. The reflection showed the hallway behind me. The door, part of the ceiling, and above that, faint, but clearly placed, was a second point of light. Not bright, not fully defined, but positioned exactly where I would expect it to be. If the sky were visible through the ceiling, I stayed still. Usually, reflections shift the moment you adjust your angle. Small distortions correct themselves almost immediately once you focus on them. This one didn't. I leaned slightly to the left. It stayed. I shifted back. Still there. For a few seconds, nothing changed. The rest of the reflection remained stable. My position, the hallway, the door. Everything aligned normally except for that one detail, placed where it didn't belong. I stepped closer. The moment I did, it disappeared. Not gradually, just gone. The reflection returned to normal, as if nothing had been there at all. I didn't try to recreate it. I knew I wouldn't be able to. Later, on the bus, it happened again. This time in the window, the interior lights were reflecting against the glass, layering the inside of the bus over the street outside. I wasn't paying attention to it directly, just looking forward. Then I saw it. 2 points of light in the reflected sky. I adjusted my position slightly, expecting the angle to break the overlap. It didn't. For a few seconds long enough to be certain, it remained perfectly aligned, unaffected by movement or shifting perspective. No one else reacted. No one looked up. The bus continued moving as usual. Then, as it turned onto the next street, the reflection shifted, and it was gone. After that, I stopped assuming these distortions would correct themselves immediately. Some of them did. Some of them didn't. And the ones that didn't stayed just long enough to confirm they weren't accidental. It started showing up in my work before I fully noticed it in myself. At first, it was small things. A timestamp entered incorrectly, off by a few minutes. A shipment flagged twice when it only needed to be reviewed once. Nothing serious. Nothing that caused immediate problems, but enough that I had to go back and correct it later. That wasn't typical for me. I've always been consistent with details. That's part of the job, and part of why I'd never had issues before. So when it happened again the next night, I paid more attention to what I was doing. Everything looked fine while I was doing it. The entries were correct. The numbers matched. I double-checked before submitting anything. But when I reviewed the same entries later, there were small discrepancies I couldn't explain. Not large errors, just slight misalignments. Like something had shifted between the moment I entered the data and the moment I checked it again. I started slowing down, taking extra time on each task, verifying everything twice before moving on. That helped, but it also made the work feel heavier than it should have. What used to take a few minutes now stretched longer, not because the process changed, but because I didn't trust the result immediately. Around the same time, I realized I was checking the sky more often. Not deliberately. It just became part of how I moved through the shift. Walking between stations, passing by a window, stepping near the loading area, I would glance up without thinking, just for a second, then return to whatever I was doing. At some point, I started expecting it to be there. That expectation was what made it harder to ignore. Even when I wasn't looking, part of my attention stayed directed upward, like I was waiting for the next confirmation. It didn't interrupt conversations or tasks directly, but it was always there in the background, pulling slightly at my focus. One night, I caught myself standing near the side window longer than necessary. I wasn't on break. I had just finished reviewing a set of entries and was on my way back to my station. Instead, I stopped halfway, looking out through the glass at the narrow section of sky visible above the loading yard. Both were there. I stayed for a few seconds, just long enough to confirm it, then went back to my station without thinking much about it. When I sat down, I realized I hadn't completed the task I had started. The system was still open. The entries partially filled. I didn't remember stopping. There was no clear break in the sequence, just a gap where my attention had shifted without me registering it. That was new. After that, I started noticing similar gaps. Short ones, only a few seconds at a time, moments where I would lose track of what I was doing, then pick it back up without a clear sense of when the interruption happened. Each time, it lined up with a moment where I had looked toward the sky, either directly or through a reflection. No one said anything at first. The errors were small enough to fix without drawing attention, and I made sure to correct them before they caused any issues. But I could tell the difference in how I was working. It wasn't just slower, it was less stable. A few nights later, someone stepped in to help with a backlog that I would normally handle on my own. They didn't mention it directly, just moved to the adjacent station and started processing entries alongside me. It wasn't unusual for shifts to overlap like that when things got busy, but this time it felt unnecessary. The workload hadn't increased. I had just slowed down. I didn't question it. I adjusted, worked alongside them, kept my focus on the screen in front of me, but I made a point not to look up as often. That lasted for a while. Then, without thinking, I glanced toward the window again. Both were still there. It wasn't just that the second moon ignored perspective. It was that it contradicted it. I had already tested how it aligned with buildings, how it held position when I moved. That alone didn't make sense. But it was still something I could observe and document. Then I noticed something else. One night, I was standing near the far end of the lot, using a taller building across the street as a reference point. From where I stood, the real moon sat just above the edge of the roofline, exactly where it should have been. The second one appeared lower, partially intersecting the building. I shifted to the side, expecting both to adjust. The real moon moved as expected. The second one didn't. It stayed fixed, still intersecting the structure. Then I moved farther, changed my angle enough that the building no longer blocked that section of the sky. The real moon shifted into open space. The second one didn't follow. For a moment, it appeared fully visible, no longer intersecting anything. Then I stepped back, and it was intersecting the building again. There was no transition, no movement between positions, just a change in how it appeared, depending on where I stood. I tested it again, this time more deliberately. I positioned myself so that the building fully blocked the area where the second moon should have been. Then I looked. The real moon was gone from view, hidden behind the structure. The second one wasn't. It remained visible, positioned as if the building wasn't there at all. I stepped forward. The building moved out of the way. The real moon reappeared. The second one didn't change. For a brief moment, both were visible again. Then I stepped back. The real moon disappeared behind the structure. The second one stayed, visible, unaffected. That was the first time it felt less like misalignment and more like contradiction. It wasn't just ignoring space. It was existing outside of it. I stayed longer than I should have that night, long enough that the shift around me stopped feeling relevant. The second moon was positioned higher than usual, not aligned with anything I could use as a reference. It just occupied a section of the sky that felt detached from everything else. I focused on it the way I had before. At first, nothing changed. Then the sensation returned. That same awareness, not visual, not physical, but specific enough that I couldn't ignore it. The sense that my attention wasn't moving in one direction anymore. I didn't look away. Not immediately. I wanted to confirm it. The longer I held my focus, the clearer it became. Like standing in a room with someone just outside your line of sight. You can't see them, but you know exactly where they are. That was what it felt like. Except there was nothing there that should have been capable of that kind of presence. I tested it. Shifted my gaze slightly to the side. The sensation faded. Brought my focus back. It returned. Stronger. I repeated it again, slower this time. Same result. At that point, I should have looked away, but I didn't. For a few seconds, I stayed fixed in place, holding that connection longer than I had before. The feeling didn't intensify, but it became more stable, less like a reaction, more like a state that held as long as I allowed it to. That was when it stopped feeling accidental. I stepped back. Not quickly, not abruptly, just enough to break the line of sight. The sensation dropped off immediately, clean, like something had been disconnected. I stood there for a moment longer, looking at the ground, letting everything else come back into focus. When I looked up again, both were still there, unchanged. But I didn't hold my gaze the same way again. And as I turned back toward the building, there was a hesitation I hadn't felt before. Not about what I had seen, but about how long I had allowed it to continue. After that night, I stopped trusting my own timing. The work didn't change, but the way I moved through it did. Tasks that used to feel automatic started requiring deliberate effort. I broke everything into smaller steps, forcing myself to complete each one before moving on. It helped for a while. Then, the interruptions started happening in the middle of those steps. Not before, not after. During. I would be entering data, focused on a single line, and without realizing it, my attention would shift. Not fully. Not enough to register as a decision. Just enough that when I came back to the screen, something was off. The cursor would be in the wrong field, or the entry would be partially completed in a way I didn't remember doing. Each time, it followed the same pattern. A brief pull upward, a glance, and then a gap. I tried avoiding it completely, adjusted my position so the windows weren't visible, kept my focus fixed on the desk. The keyboard. Anything that didn't reflect light. It didn't matter. Sometimes it showed up indirectly. A reflection in the screen. A faint outline in polished metal. Not clear enough to see fully, but enough to confirm it was there. Waiting. The mistakes started slipping through. One night, I finalized a report without verifying the timestamps. It wasn't something I would normally miss. The error carried forward into the next process, delaying a shipment that had already been scheduled. It got flagged. Not immediately, but later, when someone else tried to reconcile the numbers and couldn't. They traced it back to my entry. No one said anything to me directly, but I could feel the shift. Tasks started getting reassigned before I reached them. Not openly, not in a way that called attention to it. Just small adjustments. Someone stepping in earlier than necessary. Another person double-checking work I had already completed. It was controlled, efficient, and completely justified. I didn't argue with it, because I knew what was happening. The problem wasn't the workload. It was the moments I couldn't account for. Near the end of one shift, I realized I had been sitting still for longer than I could measure. The system was open in front of me. The same screen I had been working on. Nothing had changed. But I didn't remember the last action I had taken. The cursor was blinking, waiting. I didn't look up. Not that time. But I could feel it there. Like it had been present the entire time. I wasn't aware of it. And the longer I stayed focused on the screen, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that the gap hadn't been empty, just unobserved. It happened without warning. There was nothing different about the shift leading up to it. Same workload, same pace, same controlled environment I had been trying to maintain. I almost skipped my break that night. Not because I was busy, but because I didn't want to step outside again. Still, I went. Routine has a way of continuing, even when you're trying to avoid it. I reached the door and paused, looking through the glass before opening it. Both were already there. I stepped outside. The air felt still, not silent, just reduced, like the space had settled into something quieter than usual. I walked to the fence and looked up. At first, it didn't register. Then I realized it was larger, not gradually expanding, just larger, occupying more space than it had before, without any transition leading up to it. I stayed where I was, watching. The edges were still defined, the brightness unchanged, but the scale didn't match anything I had seen before. It felt closer, not in distance I could measure, but in presence. I focused on it longer than I should have. The sensation returned immediately, stronger than before. Everything else began to fade, not physically, but in importance. The building, the road, the distant movement of cars, all of it felt secondary. My attention narrowed. I didn't try to stop it at first. I just stood there, watching. At some point, I realized I didn't know how long I had been standing there. It didn't feel long, but it also didn't feel short. Just unmeasured. That was when I tried to look away. It didn't happen right away. For a few seconds, my focus stayed fixed, like it needed to complete something before it could release. Then it broke. Clean. The environment came back all at once. Sound first, then space, then everything else. I stepped back from the fence, looked down, waited. When I looked up again, both were still there. Same size, same position, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not in the sky. In how long I had stayed there without realizing it. It stopped after that. Not slowly. Not in a way I could measure. The next time I looked, it just wasn't there. At first, I assumed I had the timing wrong. That I had stepped outside too early. Or too late. That I had missed the window where it usually appeared. So I waited. A few minutes longer than usual. Then a few more. Nothing changed. The sky stayed the same. One moon. Clear. Consistent. Exactly where it should be. I went back inside and didn't think about it much that night. But the next shift was the same. And the one after that, no matter when I checked, it didn't come back. Work stabilized quickly. The errors stopped. The gaps in my attention faded until I stopped noticing them entirely. Tasks felt normal again. Predictable. Controlled. No one mentioned the change. There was no conversation about improvement. No acknowledgement that anything had been off in the first place. The workflow returned to its usual rhythm without explanation. It was as if nothing had happened. That should have made it easier to move on. And for the most part, it did. The routine settled back into place. The environment felt stable again. Even the reflections that had started to feel slightly misaligned during the day returned to normal, or close enough that I stopped checking. I still step outside during my breaks. Same time, same place near the fence. The air still feels different when I leave the building. The traffic still moves in steady intervals. Everything continues the way it always has. And sometimes, without thinking, I look up, not expecting anything, just out of habit. The sky is always the same, clear, empty, nothing out of place. But the moment before I confirm that, just before my eyes fully adjust, there's always a brief hesitation, a fraction of a second where something almost fits into the space where it used to be. Not visible, not defined, just close enough that I don't look away immediately. I don't document it anymore. The notebook is still in my bag, but I haven't added anything to it since the last night it appeared. There isn't anything to record. No pattern, no position, no confirmation, just absence. And the awareness of where something used to be. That's the part that hasn't gone away. Not the memory of seeing it, but the certainty that if I focus long enough, if I hold my attention there just a little longer than I should, something might still be there, waiting for me to notice it again.